The Syrian army has recaptured the historic Palmyra citadel from Islamic State terrorists, achieving a symbolic victory and gaining a strategic location. Well, here you can see the citadel in the hills, and next to it, to the right, you can see the ancient city of Palmyra itself. Now, gaining control over the citadel, well, it gives the army a significant tactical advantage. And indeed, let's take a look at the latest footage from our video agency, Ripley. The fortress, located on the outskirts, as we just saw on the map, of the city, is also seen as an important launching pad for further strikes on ISIS. The offensive to liberate the city, known as the Pearl of the Desert, is said to be moving rapidly, with Syrian forces continuing to regain more territory from the jihadists. Reporting from Syria, Lizzie Phelan.
Spectacular, very rapid advances that we're seeing right now by pro-government forces. We're in contact with sources that are in direct contact with the Army Command Center on the Palmyra front, and they say that pro-government forces are now in control of several strategic mountains that are overlooking the ancient city of Palmyra. They also have under their control that famous citadel, although they don't have any forces stationed there. It's just filled with improvised explosive devices, mines, but it is under their control. They're now in the process of storming the city. This is the second time that pro-government forces are in the process of liberating Palmyra from ISIS. The group first took control of Palmyra in May 2015. They were defeated there last year. ISIS again retook the ancient city of Palmyra in December last year in a shock offensive as pro-government forces were focused on retaking the city of Aleppo. The American forces were accused at the time of allowing ISIS to leave Mosul in Iraq into Raqqa, who then traveled from Raqqa onto Palmyra, which some say enabled ISIS to retake this precious city.
Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii held a press conference on Capitol Hill today to bring attention to her bill, the Stop Arming Terrorists Act. The event came the morning after President Donald Trump's first address to a joint session of Congress, which Representative Gabbard attended with a special guest, Tima Kurdi, whose family was made refugees by the war in Syria. When they attempted to flee to Europe, their story came to a tragic end.
A toddler face down on the beach, drowned in his search for sanctuary as the country he hailed from plunges deeper into war. Little Alan Kurdi came to symbolize the refugee crisis to the world. His aunt, Tima Kurdi, says it was a wake-up call.
People expect me to call for the overthrowing the Syrian government, but I refuse. I do not support one side of the other in the conflict in Syria. I stand for my suffering people.
Tima is in Washington as a guest of U.S. Representative Tulsi Gabbard, who recently introduced the Stop Arming Terrorists Act, which, according to her office, would stop the CIA or other federal government agencies from using U.S. funds to provide arms, funds, intelligence, and other support directly and indirectly to armed militants allied with terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. President Trump did not address the question of arming so-called moderate rebels in Syria in his first speech to Congress since assuming office. Rebels, which according to the New York Times are in alliance with Al-Qaeda's affiliate in the country, the Al-Nusra Front. Even the Wall Street Journal concedes some of Syria's largest rebel factions are doubling down on that alliance despite warnings from Washington. Yet Gabbard has been consistently smeared for her position the U.S. should end support for these groups and for recently traveling to Syria to talk with Syrians, including President Bashar al-Assad. I asked her why it's so difficult in Congress to take her position.
Oh, it's really not a difficult position, nor should it be. I think every American would be surprised to know that for years our government has been providing both direct and indirect support to these armed militant groups who are working directly with or even under the command of terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, all in their effort and fight to overthrow the Syrian government. Our bill does a simple thing, and it says that our taxpayer dollars should not be used to provide arms, money, intelligence, or other types of support to militant groups who are working with, allied with terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, nor should we be funneling taxpayer dollars through countries like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, and others who are providing this direct and indirect support to terrorist groups.
It's a straightforward goal. End U.S. support for extremist groups which have only proven time and time again they'll one day turn their guns on us.
America's favorite war weapon may soon turn into the weapon of the world. A top U.S. counterterrorism official predicts drones will soon be used by terrorists to swarm, penetrate, and defeat militaries.
Islamic State is increasing its use of drones and suicide vehicles in the fight to hold on to its last urban stronghold in Iraq. The militant group uses weaponized drones to target Iraqi forces trying to retake the city of Mosul, which the group seized in 2014. As Islamic State is squeezed into a smaller area in the western part of the city, the militants have fine-tuned their drone usage, loading them with grenades to drop over targets. Iraqi forces respond with rifle fire and high-tech gadgets and use drones of their own. The US-led coalition in Iraq says Islamic State's increased drone capability won't have a major impact on the state of the battle for Mosul. But the group uses drones to target civilians and aid workers and continues to terrorize people who used to live under its rule. On Wednesday, an Iraqi commander said troops are approaching Mosul's main government complex in the city's western half, the Associated Press reported. Some 8,000 civilians have fled the western part of Mosul as the battle has raged on. Iraqi forces launched the push to take the western half of Mosul from the Islamic State group last week, after securing the eastern part in January. US military personnel are on the ground to advise and coordinate with Iraqi forces.
Well, the western Mosul especially would be a difficult fight for any army, so it will no doubt be challenging. But I have no doubt, again, that the Daesh is trapped, that there's no outcome but one for this, and that's the defeat of Daesh.
Well, the death toll rises in 2 terror attacks in Afghanistan, the near simultaneous Taliban bombings hitting the country's capital. One targets a police station, the other, the intelligence service offices. Connor Powell is following that story live from our Mideast Bureau in Jerusalem. Connor.
John, these twin attacks in Kabul come just a few days after a senior Taliban commander was killed in a U.S. airstrike over the weekend, and some people are saying that this is connected to that attack and the killing. These attacks, though, are very similar to what we've seen the Taliban carry out in Kabul really for the last decade or so. A pair of attacks targeting government, military, police buildings and headquarters, using a bomb in the first case in the western part of Kabul, a large car bomb exploding near the gate, and then attackers with guns rushing in. A several-hour gun battle then followed. Ultimately, the Afghan police and the military were able to kill all of the attackers, but not before 16 people were killed in total between the 2 attacks, and dozens more were wounded. Now, President Trump last night talked about a lot of things in terms of national security, but he did not talk about Afghanistan last night during that State of the Union address. But the Pentagon is working on a plan whether or not to send additional troops to Afghanistan, whether or not to ramp that war up. But, John, the larger issue that the U.S. has had in Afghanistan for the last several years or so is it doesn't really matter all that much the troop numbers when the Taliban have been able to use neighboring Pakistan as a base of operations to go in and out of Afghanistan, attacking both Afghan civilians and police and military and U.S. forces. The larger issue has not been the number of troops in Afghanistan, but how to deal with that safe haven across the border. No word yet, John, about what the U.S. might do in terms of that issue and how it deals with the overall problem of Afghanistan.
The United Nations Security Council is visiting 4 West African countries that are being affected by the Boko Haram terrorist group. Niger, Nigeria, Chad, and Cameroon all face a serious humanitarian crisis. And Fidelis Mbah joins me now in the studio to shed some light on what's happening there. So the culmination of this visit should be a clear agreement with the countries involved that are hosting refugees who fled Boko Haram violence. So tell us what that agreement will entail.
Well, this is actually like the first major delegation from the United Nations, because before now we've had affiliates like the UNICEF, like UNHCR, raising concerns about the plight of refugees and the conditions there. Now, all the countries involved, that's Nigeria, Niger, Cameroon, and Chad, will have to sit together and agree on the modalities for voluntary repatriation of those who actually want to return back to Nigeria, because most of these refugees we're talking about were people displaced from Nigeria who fled into these neighboring countries. And then also to halt the repatriation of people who were forcibly taken back to Nigeria, because just recently about 500 Nigerians were sent back, not minding the conditions, because they fled because their place was not safe. And now you're forcing them to go back to that very place, which is actually going to expose them to either being killed or, for the male, being conscripted into Boko Haram.
Barakwang's nephew, Nyagwande, has been suffering from diarrhea for days, but only water available to quench his thirst is from the nearby swamp here in Padie.
He drank water which is not clean, and the food we found we couldn't cook well. Now he has diarrhea, is vomiting, and maybe has malaria.
Padie is in Lear and one of the areas where famine was declared in late February this year. Drinking dirty water is often the only option, and with bodies weakened by hunger, not all who fall sick survive. Aid organizations say more than 100 people died of cholera alone over the past 6 months, and Yanenboom fears her children could suffer the same fate.
I left my other children at home to find food. They are sick with diarrhea, they're vomiting. They say they have headaches.
More than 3 years of conflict in South Sudan has left nearly half of the country's population facing severe food insecurities. More than 100,000 people are in the grip of famine, and that number is expected to rise.
Somalia's president has declared a national disaster over a drought that puts millions at risk and may become a famine. President Mohamed Abdullahi Mohamed made the announcement Tuesday, February 28th, and called for international aid. One day earlier, the World Health Organization warned that Somalia was at risk of its third famine in 25 years. The last famine in 2011 killed approximately 260,000. The United Nations World Health Organization estimates that 6.2 million people, around half of Somalia's population, are in need of aid. It says there are over 363,000 malnourished children and 70,000 severely malnourished children in need of immediate support. The WHO also says drought is leading to an increase in diseases like cholera and measles. Al Jazeera reports the humanitarian crisis is exacerbated by the threat of militant group Al-Shabaab, which limits the movement of Somalis looking for food and water.
It's exactly 100 years since an act of Congress made Puerto Rico a U.S. territory and Puerto Ricans U.S. citizens. Since then, millions of them have flocked to the U.S.
This is Spanish Harlem, the traditional heart of the Puerto Rican community here in New York City, an area that saw an influx of tens of thousands of migrants from Puerto Rico between the 1950s and the 1980s. People in search of work and a better life.
With the island in more than $70 billion of debt and unemployment at 12.4%, they're now being joined by younger Puerto Ricans who are taking advantage of their US citizenship to move to the mainland. Despite being citizens for a century, Puerto Rico is not a state, and its residents are treated differently from the majority of Americans. Puerto Ricans living on the island are not entitled to vote in presidential elections, and the territory loses out on tens of billions of dollars of federal funding. And while their status also means they don't pay federal taxes, many believe becoming a US state will help solve the island's economic problems.
We have a pro-statehood governor in Puerto Rico, a pro-statehood legislature in Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico is in fairly desperate economic condition. So I think there are a lot of legislators here in the U.S. who are considering or offering a greater amount of consideration to the idea of statehood for Puerto Rico than they have in the past.
President Trump has said he would not support the US government helping Puerto Rico with its debt, but has stated that Puerto Ricans should be entitled to determine their political status. 100 years on, and citizenship has had a significant impact on both Puerto Rico and the US. Around 5 million people of Puerto Rican origin now live on the mainland. That's 1 million more than the entire population of Puerto Rico itself.
The Spanish government has taken a radical step to try and sort out the country's declining birth rate by creating the position of a sex czar. Last year, Spain recorded more deaths than births for the first time since World War II, promoting the government to take action by trying to encourage a baby boom and counteract the population slump. Adelmaya Berria-Diz was named the woman for the job. She's been appointed government commissioner with special responsibility for challenging the nation's sliding birth rate. Spain is the latest country to take action on a demographic issue, and it's perhaps doing so more tactfully than some of its neighbours. In 2016, Italy announced its first fertility day with a tone-deaf campaign, and Denmark had cheerful drives in the media with its Do It for Denmark initiatives. This week, Berria-Diz began working with communities to understand the nature of the problem.
The Texas state legislature will soon debate a controversial bill that would protect doctors if they intentionally mislead some pregnant patients. The so-called wrongful birth bill would shield doctors from lawsuits if they leave out information or lie to a patient about a pregnancy because they think the diagnosis could lead to an abortion. The bill's author, Senator Brandon Creighton, said the measure would prevent discrimination against children with disabilities. He believes it matches up with, quote, a large majority of Texans and their values. But opponents say the bill permits doctors to lie to patients with no consequences. They also say it could leave parents unprepared to deal with the medical expenses of caring for a child with a disability. Margaret Johnson of the Texas League of Women Voters said, quote, this bill places an unreasonable restriction on the constitutional right of a woman to make an informed decision. The bill has yet to go to the full state legislature, but it already appears to be on shaky legal ground. In 1975, the Supreme Court ruled a Texas couple should be able to sue their doctor because he didn't tell them their child would be born with failing organs.
The study looked at 23,000 pediatric cancer survivors from 1970 through 1999. While researchers believed that a patient's exposure to radiation therapy could lead to subsequent cancers, they weren't able to prove it until now.
And we saw these really beautiful reductions from the 1970s to the 1980s to the 1990s. It sort of was this aha moment, like we're onto something, we're really on the right track.
That aha moment for Professor Lucy Turcotte was the realization that the move away from unnecessary radiation therapy for cancer patients was the right way to go.
Can cause second cancers, and that's particularly concerning. We've seen a number of individuals with breast cancers, thyroid cancers, skin cancers, really cancer anywhere in the body that's been exposed to radiation.
The study found that those diagnosed in the 70s had a 2.1% rate of subsequent cancers, while those diagnosed in the 90s had a 1.3% rate. Turcotte says that coincides with the decline in the percentage of pediatric patients receiving radiation therapy.
Our hope is to more clearly define which individuals absolutely need it, and if there's certain children that we can save from needing it.
Turcotte says the work is not over. They're looking at the impact of certain chemotherapy treatments and how they interact with radiation.
I think it's sort of a call to action that our work isn't done yet. There's still a lot of research and a lot of work to be done to further reduce the risks for these second cancers.
New robots are being developed to help clean aging nuclear facilities, too dangerous for humans to access. The United Kingdom has given £4.6 million to a team of universities and private partners to develop better robotic technology for cleaning nuclear facilities. The University of Manchester says current robotic systems are useful, like when they are used to clean the Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011. However, they have their limitations. For instance, they struggle to turn valves or navigate staircases. The team hopes to develop new robotic technology that will have improved sensing, communications and processing power. Professor Barry Lennox from the University of Manchester said in a statement, quote, "If we are to be realistic about clearing up contaminated sites, then we have to invest in this type of technology."
On a remote stretch of coastline in northern Quebec, these are some of the oldest rocks on the Earth's surface, and within them, according to scientists from Canada and Britain, evidence of fossilized bacteria that could be over 3.5 billion years old. Dr. Dominic Papineau of University College London made the discovery on an expedition to the shores of Hudson's Bay several years ago.
This is a slab that's been polished. There are these structures here. It is cut on the right-hand side, but you can see kind of a structure that bends the layering in this rock. And it is within these features, in part, that we find the microfossils.
Using laser technology to date the rocks, the scientists determined that they were probably part of the ocean floor when they first formed. There's evidence of undersea vents that emitted boiling water, and that's what might have caused early bacteria to grow. Rock formations seen on Mars and other planets suggest such vents existed there as well, and these results could be used by those who search for evidence of extraterrestrial life.
If we are right with our new model for the origin of these spheroidal structures in these rocks that contain these fossils, then we might want to look for these kinds of things on other ancient planetary surfaces, such as the surface of Mars, for instance.
The research is proving controversial. Other scientists in the field have said that the patterns in the rock from Quebec are more likely inorganic crystals, not fossils.
According to the U.S. Geological Survey, Oklahoma and Kansas will continue to experience damaging earthquakes due to activities by the oil and gas industry. But the report also notes that the overall seismic hazard for 2017 is lower than last year. Released in its second annual forecast on natural and human-caused seismic risk, the forecast follows years of speculation about the coincidence between Oklahoma's recent spike in seismic activity and an oil boom in the state. Scientists have attributed the increase in seismic activity to the use of water disposal wells. The forecast is a part of the USGS National Seismic Hazard Mapping Project.
A 25-year-old Nicaraguan woman died on Tuesday after she was thrown into a fire, apparently to drive demons from her body. Authorities say witnesses saw the woman stripped naked before being burned.
The victim's husband said the mother of two was taken inside a church last week. Members thought she was possessed after she allegedly tried to attack people with a machete. An evangelical pastor has been arrested along with 4 other people. The pastor denied wrongdoing, saying the woman fell into the fire. He also claims the exorcism worked and that a demon exited her body.
Is Oprah Winfrey pondering a run for the White House? Winfrey says President Donald Trump's victory has her rethinking whether she could be elected. She talked about it in an interview with Bloomberg's David Rubenstein. She says before Mr. Trump's election, she thought that she didn't have the necessary government experience to run the country. Winfrey supported Hillary Clinton during the campaign.
An Obama-era rule on gun background checks was officially overturned on Tuesday. As expected, President Donald Trump signed a bill that had already passed both houses of Congress. At the end of his term, former President Barack Obama mandated the Social Security Administration hand the FBI info on any person with a documented mental health issue who can't manage their disability benefits without a representative. The Obama administration predicted the rule would affect roughly 75,000 people. Supporters argued it kept some with serious mental health issues from buying guns. But opponents argued the rule was too broad and overestimated the risk to the public. To be clear, studies have found having a mental illness doesn't increase a person's chances of using a gun violently and only slightly increases the risk of a gun-related suicide.
At least 3 people are dead in the Midwest after tornadoes barreled through the region. A fast-moving storm system spawning twisters from the lower Mississippi Valley to as far north as Illinois yesterday, destroying homes and uprooting trees. The threat now extending to more regions. Matt Finn has more from the center of the storm just southwest of Chicago. Matt, are people back home yet, and what's happening in that area now?
Dana, right now property owners and families are returning to their homes, and as you can see, many people are returning to total devastation. You're able to see inside some of these homes and see some of the heartbreaking damage. First responders and emergency crews have rushed in to make sure gas and electricity is shut off. You can see there are many downed power lines getting blown around in the wind, touching wet surfaces. We had a chance to speak with some of these neighbors who described the terror of the tornado ripping through their homes.
It was just like you see in the movies. We were in our living room, or in our bathroom, in the bathtub, and we seen daylight in the bathroom, then it got dark. We were in the eye of the tornado, just watched it go through. Loud booms.
What was running through your mind?
We're gonna die. I don't know, it was nuts. I didn't, like I said, you don't ever expect this to happen.
The governor just toured this area, praising neighbors and emergency crews. The Red Cross is on hand. We learned in neighboring Ottawa, a 71-year-old man was killed. A tree hit him on his property. The fire chief here saying this is the first time a tornado has ever hit this town, and unfortunately, it has left a path of devastation. Dana?
And Matt, the storm threats aren't entirely over?
Not entirely over. This storm has been heading east, and there are thunderstorm warnings from Boston all the way down to Florida right now, Dana.